Hey, this is Shannon Holton, Real Salty Dietitian and owner of Sound Growth Nutrition and Wellness. For today's Fun Research Friday, I am taking a little different route. I decided to go online and search what are the top nutrition searches in Google. And one of the things that I found was gluten, which also happens to be coincidental because this is Celiac Awareness Month. So those who know that celiac is related to an inability to tolerate or consume gluten. But there are a lot of other people following gluten-free diets for other reasons, and we'll talk about some of those and cover the topics that are associated with gluten, what gluten is and what it's in, and just kind of all of those aspects around that conversation, since it was one of the top Google searches. You may notice that I'm in some fancy headgear. I actually have still got some issues with microphones. So, in order to bring a better sound quality, I pulled out my webinar meeting headgear and am going to provide that better sounding quality so that you can actually hear my videos this week. I first will start by saying what gluten is. And gluten is essentially the protein component of things that are from wheat, barley, and rye typically. Usually, when we're allergic or sensitive, it is typically the protein that we're allergic to, but there's also intolerances, and we'll get to that in a minute. The things that come about with relation to gluten and medical reasons why people avoid gluten. First of all, we mentioned celiac disease. It is an autoimmune condition. We don't really know how that develops and where that comes from, but it is only covering a really small portion of the population. So, really, only about 1% or less than 1% of the population is affected by celiac disease. So, it's when your own body cells attack your small intestine after you consume gluten. It doesn't happen if you don't consume gluten. When we also think about people that avoid gluten, a lot of times people will say that they have gluten sensitivity. That is a very ambiguous term and something we don't really have a lot of diagnostic information about at this point. There isn't a one test way to check if you're gluten sensitive like there is if you have celiac. They will do intestinal biopsy for celiac, and if you're consuming gluten at the time that you do the biopsy, you can tell whether or not that damage has occurred related to the consumption of gluten. You can't get a positive test if you're not eating gluten. With wheat allergy, you can test for that. You is also can eliminate that and see if that improves your symptoms and signs. That is generally what people do when they feel that they're gluten sensitive. If your doctor feels you're gluten sensitive, typically those kinds of symptoms again are a little bit vague, and often it's bloating, constipation, diarrhea, which can also be related to many other things. So again, typically we recommend an elimination process to kind of work your way down to figuring out if it is the gluten that is causing you the issue. Gluten is contained, like I mentioned, in wheat, barley, and rye. But the other thing that's of concern, especially if you're very sensitive or if you have celiac, is that gluten is also used as an additive. It is a thickening agent, and those who cook or bake may think of using flour to thicken sauces, like when you're making homemade macaroni and cheese, or if you're putting it in your apple pie to make sure that your sauce and your sugar and juices thicken from the apples. And so it's hard if you're buying over the counter or store bought items to always know whether or not gluten's going to be in there. Obviously, if it has a crust or if there's bread or if there's grains visible in it, then you might assume or presume or know that there's gluten in there. But if it's a food that has a sauce, you mix a packet of rice with a little seasoning packet, there could be gluten in there to use as a thickening agent. So it's really more cautious when you do have celiac disease to make sure that you're able to look at labels and see whether or not gluten is present in that item. So it's not just as simple as avoiding wheat, oats, or wheat, barley, and rye. Oats are one of those ambiguous ones. Some people with celiac have issues with oats. Most do not. You can actually typically eat oats if you have celiac disease because the protein is just enough different that it doesn't cause a problem for the majority of people that have gluten or celiac sensitivity. If we're looking at gluten from a diet perspective, it's important to know that calorie for calorie, the substitutes that are out there in terms of the gluten-free breads, gluten-free pastas, pancake mixes, all that kind of stuff, generally speaking, they aren't lower in calories. They have to put some kind of starch in there to replace the gluten product that was in the original version. So if you're eating gluten-free breads and cereals and things like that, you're still going to get about the same amount of calories. Typically, the starches that they use to replace it are potato, pea starch. Tapioca starch is another really common one that's used in replacement. And then also, obviously, if you buy corn versions of products, things that are whole corn, those are going to be replacements for. And we all know that those are starchy foods. So you're not going to save calories if you are using gluten-free substitutes. Now, if you take the approach and avoid anything of the food type, so avoiding bread altogether or avoiding cereals altogether, you could be missing out on some really important nutrients that your body actually needs. It's important to consume foods from all the food groups. So if you're avoiding bread altogether or you're avoiding cereals altogether, you may miss out on some important, B vitamins. A lot of times cereals are fortified with other nutrients that we miss in our daily lives. So it's really important if you do have concerns if you have celiac disease or if you have gluten sensitivity, that you talk through those symptoms and those concerns with your doctor and potentially reach out to a dietitian that can help you develop a really good elimination diet process so that you are still getting all the nutrients your body needs while working through what it is that's causing your sensitivity. I will also mention that intolerance is different from allergy. I could do a whole lecture on that. But allergy, again, is usually related to the protein in the food item. A milk allergy is related to milk protein. A egg allergy is related to the protein in the egg. Peanut allergies, same thing. Oftentimes people with peanut allergies can actually eat things that may be fried in peanut oil because they are allergic to the protein, not the fat part. But when we think about our concerns, if we have concerns about whenever I eat bread, I feel X, Y, and Z, it may not be the gluten. Always keep in mind that it could be an intolerance to another component in the bread. For example, it could be related to yeast. I often use the lactose intolerance as an example. If you're lactose intolerant, you don't have a milk allergy. You're just intolerant to the milk sugar, not the allergy to the milk protein. So if you're concerned and if you think it could be something related to bread that you eat, or if I eat pasta, I always feel bloated, think about some of the other ingredients and the other components in that food item that could be causing the intolerance. It may not be gluten, and you could be avoiding a whole food group without needing to if you really are just intolerant to one of the components that's not gluten. I do know a lot of people that follow gluten-free, and again, it's something that I am passionate about, mostly because I don't like it when people avoid a whole food group for no, significant reason, and it hasn't been tested or tried or explored with a doctor to make sure that they're not missing out on key nutrients. So that is my tidbit for today, for Friday. I hope that everybody has a great weekend, and I will talk to you next week.